if these other conditions that people are told are incurable can resolve, if I somehow accidentally reversed 3 cavities in my mouth and they tell me that cavities can't reverse, if a broken bone can heal, why can't every part of the body heal? And to me, the answer became clear eventually, it can, but then you have to ask the question, what does it need in order to do that?
Katie, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you guys.
Yeah, we're honored to have you on the show. I think we said this when we appeared on your podcast that we got to meet at Sun Life Organics off of South Congress in Austin, where we've actually met a lot of our incredible podcast guests. And as soon as we showed up, Khalil, who's the owner of Sun Life, said, "You have to meet Katie. She runs Wellness Mama." And we had actually already been following your Instagram account and didn't realize you were at the shop. So we were able to connect, and I felt like we hit it off immediately. But you have such an amazing story, being a mom of 6 kids, building out this amazing brand in the health and wellness space since 2006. I think there's a lot of really cool things that we can dig into that will be relatable to our audience. But just for your background, Katie, I know you had a pretty incredible healing journey. If you would be willing to share that with our audience, that would be a great place to kick things off.
Absolutely. And I'll share sort of high level so I don't take too much time, and then you can get specific on anything you want. The short version is I actually went to school originally for journalism and was very type A, thought of potentially a career in law or politics, extremely driven. In hindsight, I can look back and say, if you want to create autoimmune disease in the body, you can just follow exactly what I did, which is to be stressed out all the time, not get good sleep, and eat processed food while doing 28 hours of course load per semester, and then get pregnant. So I don't recommend that path, but that was mine at that point. And thanks to my journalism background, I started turning to the research. So I simultaneously had this brand new baby and was having all these weird health symptoms. And I read in Time magazine that year that for the first time in 2 centuries, the current generation of American children would have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. And just looking at my tiny newborn, I decided that wasn't good enough for him and it wasn't good enough for anybody's child. And started to ask the questions of why are we seeing that? Why are we seeing this shift happen that has been going the other direction for most of recorded human history? What are the variables that are coming into play there? And it was a long journey for me to unravel that also lined up with my own personal health journey. And like many of your listeners perhaps have had a similar experience of going to many doctors and being told either A, that everything was normal and that those were all just things that come along with being a woman or having a baby, and knowing that my experience of life at that point of falling asleep in front of the door so that my kids wouldn't run in traffic was not normal. Even if it was common, it wasn't normal. And so I turned to the research side to start trying to figure out the reason things were happening. And as I did, I realized there were many other people in similar situations or whose kids were in similar situations looking for answers as well. And 15 years ago, there wasn't the amazing resources available that there are now. And I'm so happy to see so many voices contributing to this conversation. But we hear the statistic that over 80% of us, some sources say over 90% of us have some marker of metabolic dysfunction or metabolic syndrome. And the great news within that, in my mind, is that means those variables are within our control to affect change. And so something that was a very slow lesson for me that I say often is we are each our own primary healthcare provider and our own healer, and nobody's coming to save us. We can work with amazing practitioners, and often we need to, but the responsibility is still within our own hands, and we are in our own driver's seat when it comes to that. And so that for me was an 8-year journey of finally getting a diagnosis of Hashimoto's, which I no longer have, learning the reasons I potentially had that, but more importantly, learning the variables within my own control that I could change that would help shift that. Because I very fundamentally believe that our bodies are innately perfectly wired for healing, that our body always wants to move to a state of optimal health. I know you have similarities in your story as well related to that. And that if we have symptoms, they're actually a message and they're a gift because it's our body speaking very clearly to us about something it needs and doesn't have, or has and doesn't need, that is giving us a message of how we can heal. And so for me, that was a lot of N-of-1 experimentation and finally figuring out those variables that worked for me. And I know often, things get dismissed when it's N-of-1, but at the end of the day, for each of us, that is the only and most valid scientific experiment that matters. Because if we figure out our variables that work for us, that's affected change in our own life, whether or not it was studied in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And so that's been my message through Wellness Mama as people have gone along with me on that healing journey. And I've seen so many others take that ownership for their own health and start to figure out their own equation and their own variables as well.
Yeah, Katie, I love your story, and it really does coincide really well with what we talk about on our show and Brett's healing journey too, which is that there are opportunities to, and we just live in the era of being able to find resources online like your blog and learn and hear other people's stories and then apply it to yourself. And I just think it's amazing how far we've come in a short period of time. It seems like the internet has really done a great job of decentralizing and democratizing some of this information so that it can get out into people's hands, and you don't really need and not saying you don't need a doctor, but you can actually take power back and start to own your own health journey. So I think it's really awesome the time we're living in where there are these resources available to us. But I imagine in 2006, when you were just getting started writing, there probably weren't a whole lot of other blogs out there. What was the landscape like back then?
You're right. It was entirely different. And not only was there not as much information available online to find easily, but there also just weren't the availability of resources. If you were trying to find products that would help your health, like I remember buying grass-fed beef out of the back of a truck that was from an Amish farmer, and this guy had driven it, and it was probably illegal in the state that I lived in. But you couldn't find these things in stores at the time. And thankfully now you can. And thankfully now there's amazing regenerative farmers and ranchers that can ship to you even. But that didn't exist when I was first figuring this out. And I think it's an interesting paradox too, because they used to say pre all the internet information available that it was the lack of information was the reason that we weren't seeing resolution of these things. And we can now probably definitively say it wasn't just a lack of information, because we have now the entirety of human knowledge available at our fingertips and our phones. There's an action component required, but thankfully we do have that information variable figured out. And so because there wasn't all these amazing resources on the internet, I was in PubMed a lot and reading studies a lot. And as I started building Wellness Mama, also reaching out to experts to get their opinion and advice. And I especially loved getting to talk to conflicting opinions, experts with conflicting opinions, because I think there's tremendous value in being able to hold conflicting viewpoints without having cognitive dissonance and to learn from each approach rather than getting so dogmatic that we dismiss things that could be helpful because they don't align with our own already existing cognitive bias. And so there was a lot of that and a lot of personal trial and error. And I certainly discovered many ways that it didn't work before I discovered the things that did help. But I think now we have such a tremendous gift in the form of all this information. And I tell people often, every expert has figured out what works for them, and there's something to learn from each of them. But that doesn't mean their exact blueprint approach is going to work exactly the same for you and your body and what's going on with you specifically. But we can learn from each of them. And if we can approach that with childlike curiosity and an open mind, and then do the experimentation and apply that to our own situation, I feel like that's where the results actually happen.
That's so well said. It reminds me of what you had mentioned earlier, Katie, about this concept of being your primary care physician, which I think is the opposite of how most patients feel in Western medicine, where it's like Dr. Blanket tells you to take these prescriptions, these medications, do this protocol. You don't deviate it. You follow them to a T. Whereas what you're saying is like, there should be this ownership over your own health because no one knows your body better than you. And again, your body is this amazing healing, regenerative piece of machinery. When you give it the right inputs for years, it's like it does have the capacity to heal, which is something I think both you and myself experienced with autoimmune disease. I'm just curious. So like in the early 2000s, when you were going through this healing process, were there any other case studies or examples of other patients that had Hashimoto's that healed? And the reason why I'm saying that is, for me, when I went carnivore in 2019, there were some case studies of people with Crohn's and colitis that had reversed these things through paleo, through carnivore, et cetera. And that kind of gave me the proof of concept of I too could heal. But I don't, like, as you said, I don't know what it looked like in the early 2000s. So was there anyone else that you could reference or draw inspiration from, or was it just kind of on your own believing in this process?
In the beginning, it was very much sort of on my own. I didn't find any case studies early on. Thankfully, now there are many, many. But even the more naturally minded doctors that I was able to work with early on gave me a lot of hope for things that would help and that would help resolve symptoms or manage it or that could feel better. But the narrative at that point was still very much that this is not something you can ever heal. It's something that can go into remission, but that you're going to be on vacation for the rest of your life. And there wasn't really a context for it being able to actually completely resolve, which for me it has. I'm no longer on medication. My labs are in range and I feel awesome. But that I didn't have an example directly to follow about that. But I found examples in other places because I found examples like the ones you mentioned of people who had resolved other health conditions. And so I started to question if these other conditions that people are told are incurable can resolve. If I somehow accidentally reversed 3 cavities in my mouth and they tell me that cavities can't reverse. If a broken bone can heal, why can't every part of the body heal?
Mm.
And to me, the answer became clear eventually it can, but then you have to ask the question, what does it need in order to do that?
Mhm.
Because like I said in the beginning, I very firmly believe that we are designed to move toward a state of optimal health. That's where our body wants to be. And I think the other thing is the language around, especially autoimmune disease, I feel like is really poor, especially in the medical model, where you're told your body is attacking itself.
Mm.
And I think there's something really harmful in your mindset if you internalize and identify with the idea that your body is attacking itself, because the body is always on your side. And if you're having symptoms or like a healing response of some sort, that's actually your body trying to do the best it can to keep you alive and functioning with the best tools that it has available. And so if it's not at the point you want it to be, ask the question, why is that? And then try to figure out how to give your body what it needs to move toward that state. But especially if anybody listening has autoimmune disease, I think that's a very small and simple but underestimated thing, is just to shift your mindset away from my body's attacking itself to my body is healing. And this symptom that I'm having is a message about my body trying to heal. So how can I get on my body's team and help it?
It's so funny you bring that up. I wanted to dive into the psychology of healing because there's really 2 types of people out there. People who get in these situations and believe that there is some intrinsic way to reframe the situation that they're in and find a way to heal. And then there's people who really never allow their mind to get to the place where they are open to the idea that like their body isn't attacking them, that they can have their body get into a position where it's nourished and able to overcome whatever autoimmunity or any disease that it's encountering. So I'm curious, do you have any practical advice in terms of how to break down these psychological barriers that people run into when it comes to healing?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think there's definitely some mindset components and then also some cognitive things that understanding them on a deeper level can help your body sort of catch up when you understand the ways to support the body correctly. And as an extreme example of this, I would point to cases like we've all heard of those situations where someone is diagnosed with cancer, they're told it's terminal, they decide to like adjust their mindset to just be present, love every moment that they have left, experience life to the fullest, spend time with their loved ones,
Mm.
and they spontaneously resolve. And that the doctors call that a miracle, or they say it's an unexplained spontaneous remission and the person is fine. There's also cases where someone is told they have terminal cancer, they're told they have a certain amount of time to live, and then they die on schedule. And an autopsy reveals they never actually had cancer. It was a misdiagnosis. But because they were told they were going to die, they did.
Wow.
And so I think we haven't studied it deeply, but the mindset component here is huge. And I think cognitively understanding that anytime we have something going on in our body and we've been given a word by a practitioner that, especially ones that end in itis, that means there's an inflammation happening somewhere in the body. And often in the medical world, that means there's an unexplained inflammation that they don't understand. So they're going to just give it an itis ending and tell you that you have dermatitis or Hashimoto's thyroiditis or whatever the rheumatoid arthritis, whatever the conditions are, that's indicating there's inflammation somewhere in the body. So the question then becomes why and how do we reduce inflammation in the body? Unfortunately, our modern lifestyles don't easily and naturally set us up for conditions of reducing inflammation, but they're great for creating inflammation. When we're exposed to artificial light late at night, when we don't get morning sunlight and line up our circadian rhythm with the sun, which we were designed to do, when we're eating processed foods that are so high in glucose that we would never have encountered them in nature, and certainly not all year round, certainly not in the winter when many populations would be eating less or eating more just protein and healthy fats because that's what they could store for the winter. So we're kind of living completely out of alignment with the way nature intended us, and then wondering why our bodies aren't performing in the way we want them to. And so I
Mm.
think it's like when you start to understand that and can connect those dots, you start to see, okay, maybe there are some simple steps that even if I have Hashimoto's and I'm so tired I can barely get out of bed, maybe I can just get out of bed and walk to the patio and sit in the morning sunlight, which by the way, if you're going to buy expensive red light devices, morning sunlight has all the spectrums of that in it, and it's free. So even if you have no budget for this, you can go outside. You can turn off the artificial light in your house after sunset and let your melatonin start rebuilding, because melatonin is a very powerful antioxidant. It's helpful in healing and repair. It helps our cerebral spinal fluid flush and reduce inflammation while we're sleeping. And we created our bodies. So if we can find little ways to start to turn what's currently for a lot of people a negative feedback loop into a positive one that also gives you more capacity and bandwidth to do the other things that will help you to get better along the way. Because I've been there. I know what it feels like to be so depleted and so inflamed that anything that requires effort seems almost undoable. And that's because often we're in that negative feedback loop where we have inflammation, we're not getting the nutrients we need in our diet, we're getting too much sugar and our glucose is too high, our body's in an inflamed state. So what are the baby steps we can do to start reducing that just a little bit, to give us a little bit more capacity to make the choices throughout the rest of the day that help us to shift that into a positive feedback loop? And because the body is so innately capable of moving toward an optimal state of being, once we start those little shifts, that it almost becomes, to use the business term, a flywheel, where it takes more effort in the beginning, but over time, the momentum gained helps the process continue and even speed up with less effort.
It would be fascinating to take a cohort of people with autoimmune diseases, Hashimoto's, Crohn's, colitis, et cetera, and just literally put them on a protocol of like daily sunlight exposure, first thing in the morning, 8 hours of sleep, real foods diet, some type of stress management, meditation practice, and have them do that for 6 months. And I would be fascinated to see the results from day one to the last day of that cohort.
That would be. And I think thankfully we're seeing a lot of people taking ownership for their own health and doing that sort of through tracking with their Oura rings, through just keeping an eye on what they're eating, and through noticing those patterns in their own life. But I find it so funny that science is now confirming what I feel like other cultures have known for thousands of years. And we've got people, thankfully, like Huberman talking on his podcast, a whole podcast just about the neurological benefits of morning sunlight. And the funny part of that is this is something humans have always done throughout history until recently. But I love that science is also confirming what nature already knows.
Okay, I was going to ask you, was there anything that you were doing specifically kind of outside of just the fundamentals and basic principles of health that really helped you turn the corner with your Hashimoto's? I know, like, from what I know of Hashimoto's, it's a very debilitating autoimmune disease where your energy is really low. It's hard to move, you mentioned even just get out of bed. So I can imagine like actually feeling like you can get over the hump and heal from something like that is really challenging. Was there anything, like any one or two things that you did that really moved the needle the most?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I think it was a combination. Like I said, I think often the simple things are overlooked because of their simplicity, but over time they can have the most profound impact. So anybody who is in that state where things are really hard, I always try to remind them there's benefits in compounding. And while one day of getting your light patterns right is probably not going to solve it overnight, 3 months of doing that, just one baby step at a time, can make a really tremendous difference. So I think the things for me were the simple ones of spending as much time outside as possible, especially because there's some really fascinating interactions. Like, we are beings made to interact with the sun. And I think a lot of disservice has been done in telling people to avoid the sun entirely for the last several decades. But there's a whole cascade of things that happen way beyond just vitamin D when we get the right light exposure. Everything from certain cells in our eyes being signaled that start the clock for our circadian rhythm, to all the different spectrum of light that we cannot see influencing our mitochondrial function, which is, I think, another key. If you need one thing to focus on what can I do that will improve my mitochondrial function, because that's the energy powerhouse of the cell. And often in a state of chronic disease, we have very depleted mitochondrial function. So of course we don't feel energetic. And of course it's hard to do things because the actual energy currencies of our bodies are not operating effectively. Light can help that. A lot of the things you guys talk about. So I moved to a very AIP type, for me for a while, very similar to carnivore before that was a term, diet, just to reduce inflammation, because I knew I was reacting to a lot of foods at that time. And so I just sort of took a blanket approach and removed everything that could be mildly inflammatory. So I was eating a lot of the foods you guys talk about, like bone broth and regeneratively raised meats and healthy fats, which I think is also a huge one, because if you don't have enough healthy fats, and enough cholesterol, which also got a bad rap, you're not making hormones effectively. Or if your stress level's high, all of that's being used to make stress hormones, not metabolic hormones or the hormones you need for normal fertility and for optimal function. But to answer a little bit more concisely, I would say more light exposure and getting light outside. And as I got energy, I started walking outside. I didn't do any intense exercise for a year when my body was in that healing state, but I walked a lot and I spent a lot of time in the sunshine with as much skin exposed as possible to let my cells start to recharge. And then I shifted from how I thought about diet, because another side effect of Hashimoto's is it makes it very difficult to gain weight. And so I had 6 pregnancies. You tend to gain weight with pregnancy anyway. And I had all this excess weight that I wasn't able to release. And I realized because of that, I had gotten in a mindset of a really negative relationship with food and also how I thought about food in my body. So I had kind of gotten into this deprivation, punishment, food is bad mentality. And as I started researching it, I realized, we hear a lot about Americans and, of course, the obesity epidemic, and we're certainly not underfed. We're getting plenty of calories in most cases. But our diet is largely devoid of an actual amount of micronutrients. And I know you guys talk about this, the protein we need for our cells to actually exist and function.
Yes.
And when we're in that state, the body in its wisdom craves more food because it's desperately trying to reach those basic micronutrient levels that it needs and the basic protein levels that it needs to function properly. So when I shifted, instead of trying to fit in any kind of macros or calories, but focused on the nutrient density of my food, that changed so much as far as my energy levels as well. And so I really just started evaluating, of the food I'm going to eat today, how can I get the maximum amount of nutrients into my body? Sort of like calories be damned. How do I get the maximum amount of nutrients into my body? And those were the first 2 baby steps that really started shifting things. I think beyond there, it does get into a lot more of the personalization. If there's specific nutrients your body needs that might not be blanket. So for instance, for me, I was intolerant to eggs for a long time when I was in the heat of the Hashimoto's. And so I hadn't eaten eggs in years and I was super choline deficient. So figuring that out, getting enough choline from supplements turned my brain on in a way I hadn't felt in years. That was a very specific case, though. That doesn't mean everybody who takes choline is going to feel amazing the next day. But there might be pieces like that that you have to figure out individually. But I would say start with light, sleep, and nutrient density. And then from there, build in the gentle, right kind of movements you need, any specific nutrient support you need. If there's therapies you need that can help speed that process of getting the bad stuff out or getting good stuff into your body, do that then. But get the foundational first, because that's going to make everything else you do work so much better.
Yeah, there's so much good information that you just said. I remember like kind of walking around a grocery store one day and just thinking how crazy it is that so many of these processed foods are so calorically dense and there's just 0 micronutrients in them at all. And that's why I think your approach is so amazing, where, it's very tough for people to figure out what the right diet is, because you have, these carnivore extremists, animal-based people, paleo, vegetarian, pescatarian, et cetera. There's all these labels around it. But I love the concept of just eating for nutrient density, because if you're eating for nutrient density, that's implying that if a food is really high in micronutrients, it's going to be a real food. So it's very difficult to overeat those things anyway. So you don't have to worry about really like tracking your calories or macros, because it's implied that you're not going to overeat those things. And you're just eating these super nutrient dense foods that will give you that energy and vitality and the ability to heal ultimately, right?
That's such a good point. Yeah, like good luck sitting down to watch a movie and instead of a bowl of popcorn, you have a bowl of beef, and good luck trying to overeat that. Because I know when I started doing this, I was like, okay, I need to hit this basic minimum amount of protein. And that was the toughest part of it for me, was like actually eating enough after years of undereating, eating enough to correctly nourish my body. And the cool part is, and I know you guys talk about this is so much simpler than it used to be. Like, I wish Noble had existed when I started this, because I was grinding up actual raw liver into my smoothies trying to get nutrients in. But now we have things literally that make eating this way as easy as eating that processed crap in the middle of the store. So this can be an easy switch. And I also find when you focus on the nutrient density, you don't need to eat as often or as much because you're actually getting nourished. And so I find this is actually easier for me. Like when I have an 8-hour in a row podcast day, I can just eat a really nourishing breakfast that's super high in protein and good fats, and I am fine until 4 o'clock.
Wow.
Even though I don't have time to eat that whole time. I feel like it can actually be the most convenient food when you just make that mental switch to thinking that way. It's like, I can easily just eat some oysters and a little bit of steak and some healthy fats for breakfast, and I'm good to go for hours. Whereas it used to cost more to eat whether it be like the oatmeal with artificial things added or whatever it was, and it took the same amount of time. So it can be an easy switch when you make that mindset shift.
You mentioned oysters and steak. Are there any other bang for your buck nutrient dense foods that you rely on?
Yeah, so for me, still like protein is the focus because I'm now in a phase of after healing and feeling great, I'm trying to build muscle pretty aggressively. So I do focus pretty protein heavy, but I think for women, especially if we only focus on the protein, we can sometimes not get enough of the healthy fats we need to make things like progesterone and estrogen, which turns out are really important for not just how you feel, but whether like your hair grows or you have your monthly cycle. And so those are the categories I really focus on, realizing I know you guys have explained this so well, but we don't have a dietary need for carbs. So those are the first to go if I'm like prioritizing nutrients. Not that I never eat them. They just aren't my focus because it's not a good nutrient dense food for the volume of food I'm eating. So it really is often protein and then healthy fats. And my diet is often extremely boring and on repeat because I know what I feel best on. So like you mentioned, I'll often have something like steak for breakfast with oysters, drizzle olive oil on it. I'll often include either bone broth or some form of organ meats when possible. Or for a while in my healing phase, I intensely craved bone marrow. So I ate an absolute ton of bone marrow. And so I'll just try to incorporate those kind of foods. And that's very much often what my day looks like is as much healthy protein as my body needs with whatever filling in the gaps with healthy fats. So whether it's avocado, whether it's olive oil, whether it's tallow, things like eggs I can now eat and feel great on, and lots of seafood. Because I think that's the other part in today's world is I feel great when I eat things like oysters and salmon for the visual benefits as well and how supportive of the eyes those are. But the American diet is also very deficient typically in omega-3s. And I'm not a fan of, when possible, getting those from supplements. I think they're better from food when it's available, just because it's a more absorbable form. And we know like any supplemental form of omega-3s can easily go rancid. So I try to focus food first. And then beyond that, I do supplement with certain things that I have found effective for me over time, but those won't be directly the same for anybody else listening necessarily. But that's kind of my very boring, very basic, repeatable pattern.
Love it.
That's awesome. It's funny how you call it boring too, because I get that it's repetitive, but as you know, those foods are absolutely delicious and incredible. And there's something about the oyster like steak combo where there's very few foods where I feel like you can feel this pulse of energy. I think oysters fall into that category. I think raw milk, liver as well, where you eat it and you feel full and satiated, but your stomach kind of just feels flat. Like you don't feel bloated. You don't feel like you need to take a nap. Like you said, you can have some steak and oysters and be ready to record podcasts for 4 hours straight. I think people don't even have that mental relationship with food, or they can't even conceive of the fact that your food can actually be filling you with energy and make you feel better after you eat it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel 0% deprived from not eating the rest of the stuff. It's not that I don't eat it because I can't. I don't eat it because I don't want it. I mean, when you live on a diet that's like steak and oysters and raw cheese and like cream in your coffee, I don't feel the need to eat anything else. I feel great.
Yeah. This is kind of unrelated, but with 6 kids, you must go through more meat and milk than anyone else in the state of Florida, honestly.
It's pretty insane. Like an average, I can sometimes cook 6+ pounds of meat for dinner and it will all be gone.
Oh my God.
That's incredible.
It's like feeding an army.
How much didn't you take? Because Harry has 3 brothers. Didn't your mom have a separate milk fridge?
We had a separate fridge, basically specifically for like milk, and then the freezer was loaded up with ice cream. It was crazy. I mean,
I love that. Some people have a beer fridge. You had a milk fridge.
Yeah.
when you have 3 boys and all of us were playing sports year round, it's like basically impossible to constantly like keep us fed. Which I imagine you've run into that before, which I would love to get into at maybe a little bit later. But one of the things that you mentioned was the hormone health, and we're really experiencing this insane phenomenon in the US and all across the world where hormone health really seems like it's under attack. And whether it's just systematically, we've shifted more towards processed foods and away from real foods, whatever the cause that people want to prescribe to why we're here, we are here. And a lot of people are struggling with hormone health. So I'm curious, do you have any opinions on how we've gotten to this place and how you would fix it, how you would address some of these hormone problems?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And like I said, this was when I was a slow learner on. So I had many years of not having optimal hormone function. I think for one, our modern environment as a whole does not set us up for optimal hormone health.
Yep.
And you can certainly use the extreme measures. They actually have done studies on this. There's one called the camping study where they took people outside for, there was, I think, different durations, but 3 to 7 days. And they had no exposure to artificial light, and their hormones entirely shifted in the span of just that amount of time. Now, I realize most of us are not going to go camp for 7 days straight with no artificial light, but that tells us something valuable about how to set up our environment to be more circadian friendly. And I know we already talked about that part quite a bit. So I think I don't really need to build on that, but get the light part right, because that makes a huge difference. You may not understand it until you feel it, but at least give it a try and you'll feel the difference, even if you don't cognitively understand it. But I think beyond that, we just simply aren't getting the basic building blocks that we need to actually create hormones, because we've been told salt's bad. We've been told cholesterol is bad. We've been told the sun is bad. We've been told all these things. And so we're literally just not giving ourselves the basic building blocks. So part of it is simply like the micronutrient thing we talked about, shifting into really eating in a way that gives us the nutrients we need to build the hormones. But I think there's also another component, which is our body has sort of two pathways. We will often use those building blocks to make either stress hormones or sex hormones. And we all know, like, if in a fight or flight situation, this is well talked about, the sex hormones are the first to go, because if you're running from the metaphorical tiger, you don't need to make a baby. But our modern environments communicate to our neurology and our biology that we're constantly being chased by a tiger. Our brains haven't adapted to the modern environment to know that when we watch the news and we see a war across an ocean, that it's not actually happening to us. So often it's just that all of our resources are being used to create stress hormones and not sex hormones. So that's the conversation about shifting away into a less stressful lifestyle in whatever way that is for you, whether it's going on a media fast and avoiding the news for a while, whether that's building in a meditation practice, or just making note of your nervous system and taking steps to be able to downshift into parasympathetic, where you can create the proper hormones. I think there's also an adrenal component here, because when we're creating stress hormones and cortisol, and especially if that's out of balance like it is for many people, the adrenals are just working harder. And that whole process is also quite mineral dependent. So for a lot of women, magnesium ends up being a really helpful building block in that process. But even simpler than that, we often are not getting enough simple salt and basic minerals in our diet or in our water supply for those processes to happen correctly. So a tip that I give that's almost free because it's so inexpensive is I will drink usually about 3 water bottles per day with a teaspoon of salt added to each one. And granted, I live in a hot climate, I exercise a lot, and I sauna. So most people may not need quite that much salt, but just getting pure basic sodium chloride can make a huge difference in that hormone production and also in your energy level. And there's a whole science to this as well. There's a book called The Body Electric, which explains a lot of the electrical components within the body, but we sort of run on voltage gated ion channels. And things like our sodium potassium pump in the cell regulates a lot of the energy function of the cell. So if we're not getting those basic building blocks, we're often going to have an energy deficiency simply because there's not enough electrical communication in that cell. And adding salt in is supportive of the adrenals and also of that electrical process in the body. A lot of people also find that helps with their digestion and their gut health and their sleep pretty tremendously. But that's a simple one that's almost free that we're just sort of missing in the modern world. And so that's when I also encourage people, try that, especially if you have hormone issues. Just add some salt to your water, get some sunlight, and then focus on the micronutrients you need to actually build the hormones.
Just very basic, just doing these things well, compounded over time will have amazing results and success for you. I'm curious, do you like any hydration powders out there, or do you just like to keep it simple and just do the teaspoon of salt per bottle of water that you drink a day?
There's some great ones out there now. What I do is usually kind of a mix personally. Like, I love Element, and my kids especially love that one because it tastes better. So for athletes and kids, that's easier. I know there's different camps on the mineral side. I do a combination. So I do the saltwater plain. I do Element, which also has magnesium and potassium that are important. And then I also have been experimenting with plant minerals, which are sort of humic and fulvic minerals, and those enter the cell in a different way. So there's a lot of potential evidence that could have sort of like a flushing, detoxifying effect to help move stuff out of the cell that doesn't need to be there. I find I feel best on a hybrid. I know it can get a little polarizing, and you have the salt only camps, and you have the like trace minerals only camps, and you have the plant mineral only camps. And I think it's a both and, not an either or. Another random note that might be relevant to some people listening is a lot of people in the modern world we know have issues with stomach acid and proper digestion. And a lot of people end up supplementing HCl to help their digestion. A lot of this sometimes can be caused by not having enough available chloride in the body. So when we're
Wow.
getting that salt, you're getting sodium and chloride, and that extra chloride, once the body's replenished, can be used to create better stomach acid. So I've personally heard from a lot of people in my own life when they started doing the salt and they had chronic constipation for years, that resolved because they were now making enough stomach acid simply from just having those building blocks available.
Mm. It's so interesting. I found that, especially on a low carb diet, you learn pretty quickly that you need salt, and that salt plays a massive role in being able to retain water, and where salt goes, water flows. And I just think it's one of those aspects of satiety that people, just in general, if you're following a standard American diet, you're probably not thinking about salt correctly. You have an adverse relationship with salt, but then, once you start to tinker with the diet a little bit, maybe go a little bit more low carb, you start to appreciate the importance of having that salt, because it can make or break the way you're feeling day to day, as you transition from a standard American diet to a low carb diet or a carnivore diet. One of the things I was curious about, Katie, is just going from the hormone health conversation to more of like a prenatal nutrition conversation. Like, what have you learned being the mother of 6 children, just the importance of eating and the foods that you incorporate into your diet as you're preparing for pregnancy?
Oh, that's a great question too. And just briefly to touch on something else you just said, I think you're right. The salt component becomes especially important if a person is in a state of ketosis, which
Mm.
I do think is very valuable. And even if someone, like, there's an argument for women not living forever in a state of ketosis, or at least cycling it for hormones. But I do think it's a really valuable nutritional and physiological state to kind of cycle in and out of, because when you are in ketosis, the body is more readily available using the things it already has. So that's why it's so effective for things like releasing excess fat, for instance. And on the energy conversation, for anybody with autoimmune disease, when you can actually shift into ketosis, so not just eating low carb and thinking you're in ketosis, but when you're actually in ketosis, you are then running, as we know, on ketones instead of glucose for fuel, which is metabolically really helpful to a lot of people who have done metabolic damage. But a side effect of that is you're creating acetoacetic acid in the body. And as a downstream effect of that, you're getting beta hydroxybutyrate, which is great for your brain and often gives you a huge burst of energy. And so I feel like cycling that can be really helpful, as well as just using that as a tool to break down a lot of the things we accumulated in our bodies from years of not having a cleanup phase and just having a building phase by eating constantly, all the things we talked about earlier.
Mm.
I think the prenatal part is such an important question as well, especially when we're staring at statistics like people saying by 2050, the fertility rate might be 0. Like, this is a very widespread problem. And it's really fascinating with pregnancy, because I don't know how accurate the statistic is, but it circulates a lot that the maximum increase in metabolic demand that the human body can tolerate is about 2.6 times your BMR. So what you would burn at rest, the maximum you can take without breaking down is 2.6. And that would be like ultra marathoners, people who are doing extreme levels of activity can often get close to that range. During pregnancy, you're constantly operating at about 2.2, because you're literally building an entire human body from scratch. And during pregnancy, the body will prioritize building a healthy baby. So it's going to take what it needs from your body. So unless you're extremely, extremely depleted, it's often not as much a conversation about the baby not getting what they need as it is about the mom not getting what she needs to thrive, because the body is going to prioritize building that baby. And having done that 6 times, I know you can get quite depleted from having so many pregnancies, or any pregnancies. And so the focus, I think, is for really nourishing the mom to make sure that she can make it through pregnancy and postpartum in as much of a nourished state as possible because of the metabolic demand on her body. A lot of midwives, I feel like, are ahead in this conversation, but even before I understood all of this, I had midwives telling me you have to eat enough protein when you're pregnant, because that actually, in the reasons that it supported me, it helps the baby as well, but it really supports the mom, and it statistically reduces the risk of some of the bigger problems like preeclampsia. And if you're prioritizing protein and fats and not carbs, it reduces the chances of things like gestational diabetes. So I think everything we're talking about amplifies when it comes to prenatal nutrition. And that really is, if you were going to use kind of the bodybuilding phase, you're in a bulking phase. You are in a massive growth phase with pregnancy. It's just going to your baby, not to you. And so I think if ever you're going to prioritize it, that's the time to do it. And I'm grateful, actually, I was pregnant so often through my healing journey, because I think we'll often do for our kids what we have trouble doing for ourselves. And I knew I needed to like really focus on protein and omegas and all those things during pregnancy. So I prioritize them a lot more.
That's great. When you're speaking, it makes me think back to that mini documentary that Heart and Soil created called Nourished on YouTube. And the most striking thing about that documentary, it went really viral on Twitter, is there's a picture of two different placentas. One is from a mom that was plant-based, and it's like this very dull, like pink color. And then there's a mom on it, the placenta of the mom that's on an animal-based diet, and it's very dark, ruby rich color. And the comparison is so striking between the difference of like the mom that probably fueled with the right foods versus the mom that fueled and was maybe a little bit nutrient deficient. And like your child is either benefiting or not based on the foods that you put into your system. And so that's obviously something that you've intimately experienced over the last, 10 plus years of having children. So did you get to see that documentary at all?
No, but I'm definitely going to check it out now.
I'll send you the YouTube video, but people were so pissed because I screenshotted the two different placentas and just posted it on Twitter. But it seems like that color, that difference just based off of the food you're eating and the placenta color, it's insane.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'll have to watch it.
Yeah.
What do you recommend in terms of blood work for people to just start to get in tune with some of these biomarkers and understanding where your hormones are at and understanding where you are at in terms of different nutrients and minerals that you need to be potentially supplementing with, or foods you need to be focusing on?
Good question. This is also an area, thankfully, that has grown up a lot in the last 15 years. I know when I first started wanting to get those labs, it was not really available at all without a doctor. It was hard to even get the ones I wanted through a doctor. Even with a thyroid component, they would test only a couple markers and not the other ones I wanted, like antibodies, and say everything was normal. And I think also that's important to realize anytime you're talking about labs, realize they can change and you can improve them. Like a lot of that is within your ability to improve. And B, the ranges that are defined as normal are simply the averages of people who get those lab tests. So that is not optimal. And I think this is where, even if you're able to get the test, you want to be aware that just because something is in the range on the test, it may not be the range that you optimally want to be in. Or that if it's in the range, that doesn't necessarily mean something is not going on in the body. And thankfully, there are now amazing doctors who kind of take that holistic approach and are understanding those lab values in a much different way. There's a company I've been using called Function Health that lets you get those labs really inexpensively on your own. And that also has a great medical advisory board on staff to help interpret them, but also uses adaptive AI to give you recommendations based on your specific labs and any inputs you put in about your diet or your wearable data or whatever it may be. And so I'm really excited to see companies like that putting that information in our hands. I just feel like if you are really ill, maybe try some of these foundational things before you go get the labs. If there's nothing acute, like if you're not having an acute problem that requires immediate medical attention, maybe try to build that positive feedback loop a little bit first, because when you get labs that look really bad, it can be really disheartening and alarmist and put you in a stress state. And so maybe try to build first and then get labs as a metric of improvement and progress versus using it as a way to go looking for more problems. If there are things within your control that you can start shifting first.
So after getting your labs done, Katie, do you have a perspective on just like supplementation in general versus real foods? And the reason why I say that is it seems like there's two camps of people where it's kind of like the real food purists that say, oh, you should be able to get everything you need in the form of real foods. And then there's kind of more that biohacking community where they're spending like $10,000 a month on supplements, which seems a little bit extreme. But I think probably the middle is somewhere that blend between the two. And I feel like that's probably the camp that you fall into. Are there any supplements that you've really benefited from taking that you kind of incorporate as part of your daily routine?
Yes, and that's such a great point. I feel like there are some polarized camps, and I've seen the progression in the last decade, at least, of even some that used to be very firmly food only, like Chris Kresser, who has done a lot of amazing research. He now has said recently on my podcast, it's not possible to get everything you need from food anymore. You would have to eat so much.
Wow.
You would be in such a calorie surplus. It's truly not possible anymore. And so you're right. I think the balance is somewhere in the middle. And I do think this is an area of personalization where you can take some blanket recommendations and then build through experimentation to what works best for you. Also, this is an area where I always like to preface by saying, approach everything with curiosity, but question everything, even me, especially me, any expert you encounter. Don't take their blanket recommendation as truth. Figure it out for yourself. So with that caveat, I'll say I've noticed I feel a big difference when I really optimize minerals, because those are, again, building blocks of hormones. And so I do a lot of magnesium, but also trace minerals. Another one that was helpful for me was silica, which is also largely missing in the modern diet, but is helpful. People think of taking calcium for their bones or collagen for their tendons, but silica is actually part of the matrix in which those things exist. Because bones, especially, if you think of just calcium, a piece of chalk is made of pure calcium and it's hard, but it's brittle. Silica is the matrix that can attach to that allows it to have both its strength and its ability to function with movement. And so since I'm doing a lot of athletic stuff, I do a lot of silica to make sure that that matrix is strong and hopefully avoid any kind of injury. I also do supplement with some plant minerals as well as methylated B vitamins, which for my genes are typically very helpful. And then for mental focus, I do several different forms of choline. So I do phosphatidylcholine, I do alpha GPC. I've experimented with others as well. I find like a lot of those things are largely missing in the modern diet as well. And then pretty much beyond that, I try to cycle everything. So I also don't think it makes sense biologically to take everything every single day. And so I either take the weekends off of supplementation or I'll cycle things in and out just to get the body what it needs, but not get it to a point of downshifting any endogenous production of things because it's always getting what it needs from outside.
Have you gone down the peptide rabbit hole at all in terms of some of the new advancements in terms of I would kind of consider it supplementation, but just a bit more specific. Have you gone down that rabbit hole at all?
Yes, and I think there's categories there as well, because peptides are simply chains of amino acids that are short. So if you're eating a nutrient-dense diet, you are getting some of those basic components pretty well. I do supplement with oral aminos, which have a lot of those components in them, and I also am a proponent of creatine. I know that can be a controversial one as well. As far as injectable peptides, I've experimented with those some, especially in like acute injury recovery when I've worked with athletes and in experimentation with myself. And the data on some of them is pretty strong. I know they're also in a kind of unknown point right now with FDA and availability to get them. But I've personally done both oral BPC, which has a lot of evidence supportive of gut health potentially. But I do know if you're taking BPC orally, it's mainly targeting your gut. That one is also, some functional doctors will give it in an injected format, which that can target tissue recovery and seemingly shorten the duration of injury recovery for a lot of people. And then there is a whole world beyond that. And I think we are just now starting to get into that. I've experimented with some. My one caution with peptides, and especially anything injectable, is again, just the idea of, are you short circuiting the body's natural mechanisms or are you working with it? I think if we're working within the body's natural mechanisms, they can be really profoundly helpful. And especially if you find someone who really knows what they're doing with peptides and can tailor them to you, they can have a really dramatic effect really quickly. I'm more cautious with, I know there's a trend right now, and this will be controversial to even bring up, but with things like semaglutide, because I feel like that is one that is potentially bypassing the body's natural mechanism, and that it does have potentially a downline cost. So we're seeing a widespread societal experiment with people dropping tons of weight from Ozempic. But the statistics I'm seeing is as much as 30% of that can be muscle. And we know that muscle is the organ of longevity, and that the more lean muscle mass you have in general, the less risk of all-cause mortality and the better that you age. And so to me, if we're using a peptide to bypass the body's natural mechanisms that is also potentially leading to muscle loss, things like that, we would want to evaluate very carefully.
Yeah, the conversation around Ozempic is one that I've been following, and it really, like, people like Callie Means, I think, have done a good job of pushing back, and there's a lot of really strong and compelling information, much of what you just said, around the fact that it's not necessarily just fat loss, it's actually muscle loss as well, which for anyone who follows Peter Attia's work or all these longevity experts, they talk about muscle being a core component of longevity and aging properly. So to me, there's definitely red flags around just the broad acceptance of Ozempic. And then it's also, like, for me, quite concerning, like, a company like Weight Watchers is now shifting their entire model away from, tracking foods and journaling and recommending like real whole foods diets to find weight loss solutions to now pushing Ozempic. Like that's a big shift in the philosophy around weight loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a huge social experiment that we're going to see how it plays out in 10 years. And I hope for all the people trying it that it turns out well. But it just seems like the body has those mechanisms in place already. So if it's possible, and if you're not in such an extreme situation where that's medically recommended, why not try to make use of the body's natural process that does the same thing first before you would jump into something that might deplete your muscle mass?
Totally.
I don't know a single example of bypassing the body's natural mechanisms ever working. I don't know. But
Exactly. Yeah.
I will tell you, BPC 157 is pretty incredible. I've never had a super severe flare up since I got healed from ulcerative colitis, but I did have a mini flare last summer, and I got my blood work done through Blokes, which is a male hormone and telemedicine company, and the doctor got me on BPC 157. And I will say, I did have some bleeding, and I took Blokes for about a week, and within 7 days, my bleeding stopped, and I was able to get out of that flare. Obviously, I was also like strict carnivore, bone broth, 8 hours of sleep. I was doing a lot of other of these modalities, but it works super, super well for me. So it's going to be exciting to see as these things get more accepted with patients with autoimmune diseases or gut issues. How is that going to be able to be additive and help get patients in a remission potentially faster than what they're currently experiencing, or maybe exposing them to a world where they don't have to just get hopped up on prednisone and some of these like damaging steroids that a lot of people are getting on now when they get sick.
Yeah, such a good point. And BPC has a pretty awesome safety profile as well. And that's one, like you, I hope that we see more use of. But I feel like for a lot of the other ones, at least start with the physiological ability to do those things yourself first and see how that works. Experiment with cycling in and out of ketosis and getting your hormones in the correct range and see if you feel substantially better just from that before you bypass those mechanisms.
Yeah, that's awesome. Katie, is there anything that you're working on right now that has you excited or that you would like our audience to hear a little bit more about?
My large focus is primarily my podcast right now as well, just because I get to talk to such incredible experts and I feel like bring all those voices to the conversation that, again, listen to them with a critical ear and with curiosity and take what benefits you and leave what doesn't. Um, it's just a side project. I'm building out an in-person wellness space where I live, which I'm really excited about. It'll have a lot of the biohacking components. And then hopefully this year I'll finish up a few books that touch on a lot of these things because I get so many questions now about the Hashimoto side and about the mindset side. And so I'm trying to unite those in one place. But in general, I would just love to see people on the podcast and to hear from people there. And that's kind of my primary wellness mama focus.
Amazing.
That's awesome. That's so cool about the in-person space too. We've been thinking more about this. I think the goal is to make money, build a business online, and then take that money and actually invest in local communities and spaces. And I think that's really how we scale this thing. Like anytime we've ever done something in person, just the connection you build, it's just irreplaceable. So it's so cool to hear that you're going to be doing that in Florida as well.
Well, and that's something we didn't even get to delve into in this conversation, but I also have this saying that humans are nutrients. And I think a lot of us are human deficient, community deficient, especially after the last few years. And so it felt really important to me to build a place where in-person community could happen. And I think that's also a component, I know it's its own whole conversation, but of blue zones. Because when you actually isolate the data, a lot of the claims made about blue zones and what they do that leads to their longevity are not true. And then there's some funny ones like a nicotine connection that might be related to longevity. But what they do all have is community. And we don't have that as much in the modern world. Like a lot of us maybe sauna, but we don't sauna together. Or a lot of us eat healthy, but we're not eating with other people that we love all the time. And so I think when there's a chance to build community into your life and people with that you're in proximity with, that actually is very health supporting and often overlooked as well. So I just love to always mention that humans are nutrients too.
I love that. Yeah, it really it touches on this spiritual component that we touch on a bit with the show, is that you can't really replace that human connection and just like the feeling of interconnectedness and good conversation and support that I think we naturally provide for each other. Like we can either be sources of stress or sources of reducing stress. And I think when you're doing that stuff around food and these like healthy habits is usually a source of reducing stress and having those memories that are really worthwhile. So maybe next time we have you on the show, we'll have to do a part 2 just on humans or nutrients. I love that concept.
Oh, I would love that.
We'll get some nutrients in when you come to Austin in early March, hopefully, right? Do a little
Yes, I can't wait.
Yeah. But no, we appreciate it so much. We're so grateful that we got to meet you. And like I mentioned, we've been fans of your stuff for a really long time, and just very grateful that there are people out like you out there that are really promoting the content that people need to hear and giving people inspiration and hope that they can heal and we can really fix the direction of the food system. So just so appreciative of you taking the time to do this, and just appreciative for everything that you do.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of Noble because my kids love it, and it's a super micronutrient dense food that's easy to get in. So I love the work you guys are doing as well, and love your podcast as well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Katie.